Marcus Grant was a man who needed no introduction. At just 42 years old, he had risen from humble beginnings to become one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. Known for his sharp mind, calm demeanor, and a reputation for treating everyone with respect, he had built a global empire spanning technology, real estate, and philanthropy. On this particular day, Marcus was heading to a crucial meeting that could launch one of his most ambitious projects yet, a sustainable energy initiative that promised to revolutionize the industry. Dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit and a purple tie that complemented his confident yet approachable personality, Marcus arrived at the airport in his usual style. Understated but impossible to miss. He was used to traveling frequently for business, but he preferred to keep things simple, avoiding unnecessary drama. As he made his way through security and into the first-class lounge, people noticed him. Some recognized him and whispered his name, while others simply admired his calm and confident stride. Boarding the plane, Marcus greeted the crew with a polite smile and a warm good afternoon. As he entered the first-class cabin, the flight attendants responded with smiles, all except one, Claire. She was new to the job, young and eager, but visibly stressed. It was a busy day for her, and she seemed to carry the weight of the entire cabin on her shoulders. Marcus found his seat by the window, placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment, and settled in with a sigh of relief. This was supposed to be a time to gather his thoughts before the big meeting. As the plane began to fill up, he noticed Claire rushing between aisles, trying to manage the last-minute requests of passengers. She seemed frustrated and overwhelmed, but Marcus thought nothing of it. After all, being a flight attendant was no easy job, especially on a packed flight. A few minutes later, as the crew prepared for takeoff, Marcus pressed the call button to request a glass of water. It was a simple request, one he'd made countless times on other flights. Claire appeared at his seat, her face slightly flushed from the stress of dealing with demanding passengers. "Yes," she asked curtly, her tone sharper than Marcus had anticipated. He smiled gently, trying to ease her mood. "Could I get a glass of water, please?" "Thank you." But instead of the expected acknowledgement, Claire's expression tightened. She seemed to misinterpret his polite tone as condescension, perhaps projecting her own frustrations onto him. "You'll have to wait," she snapped. "I have other passengers to attend to." Marcus was taken aback, but chose not to react. He nodded calmly and said, "Of course. Take your time." The exchange caught the attention of a few passengers nearby, who exchanged puzzled glances. Marcus returned to his seat, his demeanor unchanged. He thought little of the incident, attributing Claire's behavior to the stress of her job. However, it was clear to others that something about the interaction had unsettled Claire. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Marcus gazed out of the window, unaware that this minor encounter was about to escalate into something far more dramatic than he could have imagined. The plane was now cruising steadily at 35,000 feet, and the cabin was beginning to settle. Passengers were adjusting in their seats, some flipping through magazines, others scrolling through their phones or ordering drinks. Marcus sat calmly in his first-class seat, gazing out of the window, enjoying the clouds rolling by. He had almost forgotten the earlier tension with Claire, the flight attendant, who had snapped at him when he asked for water. For Marcus, it wasn't worth holding a grudge. He believed in focusing on the bigger picture, and there was a lot on his mind regarding the groundbreaking project he was about to present. Claire, however, was not as composed. The earlier exchange with Marcus kept replaying in her mind. She had been on edge all day, and the weight of her responsibilities was starting to take a toll. While most passengers were polite, she had dealt with a few demanding travelers in coach class before boarding even began. When Marcus requested water earlier, she misunderstood his calm tone as impatience. She didn't know who he was, just another first-class passenger in her eyes, and her frustration had bubbled over. Now, as she walked up and down the aisles, ensuring passengers were comfortable, Claire kept glancing at Marcus. Something about his composed demeanor unsettled her. He hadn't argued or raised his voice, which made her feel oddly guilty. But instead of owning up to her earlier outburst, her stress made her defensive. To her, his calmness felt like silent judgment. Meanwhile, Marcus decided to make a simple request again. Feeling thirsty, he pressed the call button. Claire noticed immediately, and her heart sank. She hesitated for a moment, feeling a mix of frustration and anxiety. Reluctantly, she approached his seat. "Yes, what do you need?" she asked, her tone still sharp but slightly more restrained than before. Marcus smiled politely. "I was wondering if I could get that glass of water now." "Whenever you have a moment, of course." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she could feel the tension building inside her. To her, his words seemed patronizing, though they were not. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her professionalism, but her frustration spilled over. "You know," she said, crossing her arms, "you're not the only passenger on this flight. I have other people to take care of too." The passengers around them began to notice the exchange. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the first-class cabin. Marcus was visibly surprised by her tone, but remained calm. "I completely understand," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Take your time. I don't mean to trouble you." His calmness seemed to irritate Claire even more. She felt embarrassed, but didn't want to back down. Instead of addressing the request, she turned and walked away, leaving Marcus without an answer. The tension in the cabin grew as murmurs spread among the passengers. Some whispered to one another, wondering why the usually professional service in first class seemed so out of character. Marcus, still seated, adjusted his tie and looked at his watch, choosing not to escalate the situation. However, it was clear to everyone watching that this was not the end of the conflict. Claire, now back at the galley, was fuming internally. She felt she had lost control of the situation, and her emotions were clouding her judgment. Meanwhile, Marcus quietly leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. He had faced countless challenges in his life, but he hadn't expected to encounter such unnecessary hostility on a routine flight. What neither of them realized was that this small misunderstanding was about to spiral into a series of events that would leave everyone on the flight talking, and forever change both their lives. The tension in the first-class cabin was almost tangible. Passengers exchanged confused glances, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Marcus Grant, the calm and collected billionaire, had been nothing but polite. Yet the flight attendant, Claire, seemed intent on escalating the situation. The air buzzed with an uncomfortable energy, and it was clear that something was brewing. Marcus, ever the professional, decided to let the matter rest. He had dealt with difficult people before, and he saw no point in creating a scene. He took a deep breath, adjusted his seat, and closed his eyes, hoping to relax for the remainder of the flight. However, his efforts to remain composed were about to be tested. Claire, meanwhile, stood in the galley, her emotions swirling. She was frustrated, not just with Marcus, but with her entire day. She had entered her shift already stressed, dealing with delays, demanding passengers, and now what she perceived as a man who thought he deserved special treatment. She couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's calm demeanor was a challenge to her authority, a silent judgment of her abilities. The more she thought about it, the more her frustration grew. Her colleagues in the galley noticed her agitation. "Claire, are you okay?" one of them asked, concern evident in their voice. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, waving them off. "I just need to handle something." With that, she grabbed a glass of water and marched back to the first-class cabin. Passengers noticed her return and watched as she approached Marcus's seat. This time, there was no mistaking the tension in her posture. Claire stopped in front of Marcus and placed the glass of water on his tray table, but her movements were abrupt, almost forceful. Marcus opened his eyes and looked up at her, his expression calm but curious. "Here's your water," she said, her voice clipped. "Thank you," Marcus replied politely, sensing her frustration, but choosing not to address it. But Claire wasn't done. Her emotions got the better of her, and she blurted out, "You think you're better than everyone else here, don't you? Sitting there all calm like nothing bothers you." The cabin went silent. Passengers stared, shocked by her words. Marcus, still calm, looked at her with a raised eyebrow. "I don't think that at all," he said gently. "I was just trying to stay out of your way." His calm response only seemed to fuel her anger. Before anyone could react, Claire did something no one expected. She slapped him. The sound echoed through the cabin like a thunderclap, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Marcus froze, his face a mask of disbelief. Around him, gasps erupted from the passengers. Some sat with their mouths open, unable to process what had just happened. Others quickly grabbed their phones, hoping to document the shocking moment. Claire, realizing what she had done, stepped back, her face pale. The weight of her actions hit her like a freight train. She glanced around the cabin, seeing the shocked faces of the passengers and her colleagues. Panic set in as she realized the gravity of her mistake. Marcus took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. He slowly picked up his phone and sent a single text message. It was a simple action, but it carried an air of finality. Those watching couldn't help but wonder what he was doing, and what would happen next. The atmosphere in the cabin was electric. Everyone was on edge, waiting to see how Marcus would respond. Claire stood frozen, her mind racing with regret and fear. She had crossed a line, and she knew there was no going back. Little did she know, Marcus's calm demeanor hid a storm. The wheels of action had already been set in motion, and the next few moments would change everything. The cabin was silent except for the faint hum of the airplane engines. Everyone in first class sat in stunned disbelief, replaying the moment that had just unfolded. Marcus Grant, the calm and composed billionaire, had been slapped by Claire, a young flight attendant. Her actions had left the air thick with tension, and no one dared to speak, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus sat still, his expression unreadable, but his mind was anything but quiet. Years of experience as a businessman had taught him the value of patience and measured action. He knew better than to respond with anger or cause a scene. Instead, he reached for his phone, calmly typing a message to someone who would understand the situation and know how to handle it. The text was simple: "Call the CEO. Tell him we need to talk immediately." Meanwhile, Claire stood near the galley, her hands trembling as the reality of what she'd done sank in. Her colleagues stared at her, their faces a mix of shock and concern. One of them, a senior flight attendant named Rebecca, pulled her aside. "What were you thinking, Claire?" Rebecca whispered harshly, trying to keep her voice low. "You just slapped a passenger, a first-class passenger. Do you know how serious this is?" I don't know what came over me," Claire stammered, her voice shaky. He made me feel so small, so judged." "Claire, this isn't about how you felt. This is about what you did," Rebecca said firmly. "You need to calm down and let me handle this before it gets worse." But it was already too late. Marcus's message had been received, and the wheels were in motion. Back on the ground, his assistant wasted no time. Within minutes, the CEO of the airline, Richard Foster, was alerted. Richard was not only the head of the airline, but also a close acquaintance of Marcus, having worked together on several charitable initiatives. When Richard received the call, he was in the middle of a meeting. But as soon as he heard the details, he immediately stood up, ending the meeting abruptly. "Get me the flight crew's contact information and an update on the situation," he instructed his staff. "This needs to be handled immediately." Back on the plane, Marcus continued to sit quietly, his calm demeanor masking the strategic moves he had set in motion. Passengers around him whispered in hushed tones, speculating about what he might do. Some admired his restraint, while others couldn't believe how composed he remained after such a shocking incident. Claire, on the other hand, was spiraling. Her colleagues tried to reassure her, but the weight of her actions was too heavy to ignore. She knew she had crossed a line, and the fear of what was coming next consumed her. Rebecca approached Marcus, hoping to smooth things over. "Mr. Grant, on behalf of the crew, I deeply apologize for what happened," she said, her tone sincere. "Please allow us to make this right." Marcus looked up at her, his expression kind but firm. "Thank you, Rebecca," he said. "I appreciate your professionalism, but I believe this is something your management will need to address." Rebecca nodded, understanding that this was beyond her control. She returned to the galley, giving Claire a knowing look that said everything. "This isn't going to end well for you." As the plane continued its journey, the atmosphere remained tense. Passengers were glued to their seats, eager to see how the situation would unfold. Marcus, however, simply leaned back and closed his eyes, as if nothing had happened. It wasn't arrogance, it was confidence. He knew that his calm actions would speak louder than any angry outburst ever could. Unbeknownst to Claire, the airline's management team was already working to address the incident. By the time the plane landed, a plan would be in place, and Claire's life would never be the same. Marcus's measured response was not just a display of his character, it was a demonstration of the quiet power that came with wisdom, experience, and a refusal to act impulsively. The stage was set for what was to come, and everyone on the flight felt it. This was no ordinary encounter. This was the beginning of a story that would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the first-class cabin reached its peak. Passengers had spent the remainder of the flight whispering among themselves, trying to piece together what had happened and what might come next. Marcus Grant, the calm and composed billionaire, had remained seated, showing no visible signs of frustration or anger. His stillness, however, only added to the mystery. What was he planning? Claire, the flight attendant who had slapped him, was a different story. She was a bundle of nerves, pacing in the galley and struggling to keep her composure. Every passing moment felt heavier than the last. Her colleagues tried to console her, but there was little they could say to calm her down. Claire knew she had crossed a line, one that could not be undone. All she could do now was brace herself for whatever awaited her once they landed. As the wheels of the plane touched down on the runway, the cabin filled with the familiar sound of passengers preparing to disembark. The usual chatter of relief and excitement after a long flight was absent. Instead, there was an air of anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next chapter of this drama to unfold. Marcus remained seated as the other passengers began to gather their belongings. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered once during the entire flight. Some of the passengers glanced at him, hoping to catch a hint of what he might be thinking. Others whispered among themselves, speculating about his next move. Meanwhile, in the airport terminal, a team of airline executives had already gathered, alerted by the urgent messages from their CEO, Richard Foster. They stood near the gate, their expressions serious as they waited for the plane to taxi in. Among them was Richard himself, who had left an important meeting to personally address the situation. He knew the value of Marcus Grant, not just as a passenger but as a partner in several high-profile projects. This was not just about customer service. It was about preserving a critical relationship. As the plane reached the gate and the doors opened, Claire felt her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the executives were waiting, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her career was about to come crashing down. She clutched the edge of the galley counter, trying to steady herself as passengers began to disembark. Marcus waited until the aisle was clear before standing. He adjusted his suit, picked up his briefcase, and made his way toward the exit. His steps were measured, his expression calm, but the flight crew could feel the weight of his presence. As he stepped off the plane, he was immediately greeted by Richard Foster and a small group of executives. "Mr. Grant, I am so sorry for what happened," Richard said, his voice filled with genuine regret. "Please know that this situation will be handled immediately, and we will do everything in our power to make this right." Marcus nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "Thank you, Richard. I trust you'll handle this appropriately." Nearby, Claire watched the exchange from the doorway of the plane. Her colleagues stood beside her, their expressions sympathetic but distant. They knew that the consequences of her actions were now out of their hands. As Marcus walked away with the executives, the gravity of the situation hit Claire like a tidal wave. She felt a lump form in her throat as she realized that this was more than just a bad day at work. This was the beginning of a reckoning that would force her to confront the choices she had made. For Marcus, it wasn't about revenge. It was about principle. He had built his empire on respect, integrity, and the belief that everyone should be treated with dignity. What had happened on that flight wasn't just a personal affront. It was a test of those principles. And as he left the terminal, he knew that his actions would send a message, not just to the airline, but to anyone who believed that success meant tolerating disrespect. The passengers, the crew, and even Claire herself had learned one thing during that flight. Marcus Grant was not a man to underestimate. And as the airport buzzed with whispers about the incident, everyone was left wondering what the full consequences of that slap would be. As the passengers dispersed into the bustling terminal, whispers of the incident lingered in the air. Many had witnessed the shocking slap, while others had only heard about it during the flight. Regardless, everyone seemed to be talking about Marcus Grant, the calm billionaire, and the young flight attendant whose rash actions had shaken the entire cabin. Some were sympathetic toward Claire, chalking it up to the stress of her job, while others believed her behavior was completely inexcusable. Marcus walked through the terminal with the airline's CEO, Richard Foster, at his side. Richard's face was etched with concern. He had always admired Marcus for his professionalism and generosity, but he also knew that this incident could have far-reaching consequences. The airline's reputation was on the line, and Richard was determined to handle the situation with the utmost care. "Marcus, I cannot apologize enough," Richard said earnestly as they walked toward a private lounge. "This behavior is completely unacceptable, and I assure you we are taking it very seriously." Marcus gave a small nod, his expression calm as always. "I understand, Richard. I'm not here to make threats or demands. I simply expect your team to take appropriate action. It's not just about me. It's about ensuring your employees are equipped to handle stress without taking it out on passengers." Richard appreciated Marcus's level-headedness, but felt the weight of the situation nonetheless. "Absolutely," he replied. "We've already started reviewing the incident, and Claire will be spoken to immediately. I will personally see to it that this matter is resolved." Meanwhile, Claire sat in a quiet room near the cruise area of the airport, waiting for her supervisor. Her nerves were frayed, and her mind raced with regret. She knew she had made a terrible mistake, but now the consequences felt overwhelming. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the moment she slapped Marcus. The sound, the looks on the passengers' faces, and his calm reaction. It was haunting. Her supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Karen who had been with the airline for over 2 decades, entered the room with a somber expression. Claire stood up, her hands trembling. "Karen, I'm so sorry," she began, her voice cracking. "I don't know what I was thinking. I just lost control." Karen held up a hand to stop her. "Claire, sit down," she said firmly but not unkindly. Claire obeyed, her head hanging low. "This isn't just a small mistake, Claire," Karen began. "You slapped a passenger, one of our most important passengers. Marcus Grant isn't just any traveler. He's a respected businessman, a partner in some of our charity initiatives, and someone who commands immense respect. What you did not only disrespected him, but also jeopardized our relationship with him." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as she listened. She had worked so hard to land this job, and now it felt like everything she had built was crumbling. "I know," she whispered. "I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Karen sighed, her expression softening slightly. "I believe you're sorry, but this is beyond my control. The executives are involved now, and the decision about your future here will come from them." As Claire sat there, feeling the weight of her actions, Marcus was sitting in the private lounge with Richard, sipping on a glass of water. The irony of finally receiving the drink he had politely requested wasn't lost on him, and he chuckled softly to himself. "What's funny?" Richard asked, looking puzzled. "Oh, nothing," Marcus replied with a small smile. "Just thinking about how the simplest things can turn into the biggest lessons." Richard nodded, unsure of what to say. He admired how Marcus remained calm and reflective, even after such a disrespectful incident. It was a testament to the kind of man he was, a man who didn't let his emotions dictate his actions. As the hours passed, the airline's crisis team worked diligently to address the situation. Public relations drafted a statement, the executive team discussed policy changes, and the HR department prepared to meet with Claire. Everyone knew that Marcus's experience could not be ignored, and the entire airline felt the ripple effects of that one moment in the sky. For Claire, the reality of her mistake was sinking in. She had no idea what her future held, but she knew one thing for sure: her life would never be the same again. For Marcus, the incident was a reminder of the importance of patience and professionalism, even in the face of adversity. And for the airline, it was a wake-up call to reevaluate how they trained and supported their employees. The plane had landed, but the journey for everyone involved was far from over. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of activity. News of the event had spread far and wide, thanks to passengers who had shared their accounts on social media. Headlines described the shocking moment a flight attendant had slapped a billionaire, sparking debates and conversations around the globe. Some people sympathized with Claire, attributing her actions to stress, while others criticized her lack of professionalism. But amidst the noise, Marcus Grant remained silent. Marcus's quiet response puzzled many. A man of his stature could have easily demanded severe consequences, yet he chose not to make any public statements. Instead, he focused on his work, leaving the airline to handle the situation. Behind the scenes, however, his actions spoke volumes. Richard Foster, the airline's CEO, personally reached out to Marcus for a follow-up meeting. Sitting in a sleek conference room at the airline's headquarters, Richard thanked Marcus for his patience and promised significant changes. "We are implementing enhanced training programs for our staff," Richard explained, focusing on stress management, customer service, and conflict resolution. What happened on that flight should never have occurred. Marcus nodded, pleased with the proactive approach. "I appreciate your efforts, Richard," he said. "My goal was never to punish anyone. Mistakes happen, but it's how we respond to them that matters. If this leads to better support for your team and improved experiences for your passengers, then something good will have come from it." Meanwhile, Claire was facing the repercussions of her actions. After an internal investigation, the airline decided to suspend her, giving her time to reflect on what had happened. It was a difficult moment for Claire, but it also became a turning point. She used the time to seek counseling, attend stress management workshops, and rebuild her confidence. She realized that her outburst wasn't just about Marcus. It was a reflection of her own struggles and unaddressed frustrations. One day, Claire decided to write a letter to Marcus. She poured her heart into it, apologizing sincerely for her behavior and expressing gratitude for how graciously he had handled the situation. "You had every right to retaliate," she wrote, "but instead, you chose to remain calm. That taught me a lesson about dignity and self-control that I will carry with me for the rest of my life." To her surprise, Marcus responded with a short but thoughtful note. He acknowledged her apology and wished her well, encouraging her to learn from the experience and grow. His words gave Claire a sense of closure and hope for the future. As for the airline, they took the incident as an opportunity to improve. New training sessions were rolled out, and employee support systems were strengthened. The airline also launched an internal campaign to emphasize the importance of treating every passenger and team member with respect, regardless of the circumstances. For Marcus, the incident became a story he occasionally shared during speeches and interviews, not as a tale of conflict, but as an example of how staying calm in the face of adversity can lead to meaningful change. "We all make mistakes," he often said, but our response defines who we are. Choose patience, choose understanding, and watch how the world transforms around you. The flight that had begun with tension and a shocking slap ended as a lesson for everyone involved. Claire learned to manage her stress and approach challenges with grace. The airline became better equipped to handle high-pressure situations, and Marcus once again demonstrated the power of calm leadership. What could have been just another scandal turned into a story of growth, compassion, and change. A story that reminded everyone that even in the toughest moments, there's an opportunity to rise above.